Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for our continuous close readings in the ecology of freedom. We are now in, if you have the printed version, we are in episode 3, the emergence of hierarchy. It's actually this episode, no matter which version you have, but if you have the printed version, it's page 130, the emergence of hierarchy. All right, we're going to read a little excerpt, and then we can reflect on it if there is something to. Otherwise, we're going to continue. The breakdown of early Neolithic village society marks a decisive turning point in the development of humanity. In the millennia-long era that separates the earliest horticultural communities from the high civilization of antiquity, we witness the emergence of towns, cities, and finally empires, of a qualitatively new social arena in which the collective control of production was supplanted by elitist control, kinship relations by territorial and class relations, and popular assemblies or councils of elders by state bureaucracies. This development occurred very unevenly, where settled agricultural communities were invaded by pastoral nomads. The shift from one social arena to another may have occurred so explosively that it acquired apocalyptic proportions. Languages, costumes, and religions seemed to replace each other with bewildering rapidity. Old institutions, both heavenly and earthly, were affected by new ones. But such sweeping changes were rare. More often than not, past and present were subtly melded together into a striking variety of social forms. In such case, we witness a slow assimilation of traditional forms to new ends, a repeated use of old relationships for new purposes. In the complex interpenetration of old by the new, early social forms may have lingered on through the entire span of post-Neolithic history. Not until the emergence of capitalism did the peasant village and its cultural repertoire disappear as the locus of rural life, a fact that will be of considerable importance when we consider humanity's legacy of freedom. Actually, the most complete shift occurred in the psychic apparatus of the individual. Even as the mother goddess continued to occupy a foremost place in mythology, but often adorned with the demonic traits required by patriarchy, women began to lose whatever parity they had with men, a change that occurred not only in their social status, but in the very view they held of themselves. Both in home and economy, the social division of labor shed its traditional egalitarian features and acquired an increasingly hierarchical form. Men staked out a claim for the superiority of his work over women's. Later, the craftsman asserted his superiority over the food cultivator. Finally, the thinker affirmed his sovereignty over the workers. Hierarchy established itself not only objectively in the real workday world, but also subjectively in the individual unconscious, percolating into virtually every realm of experience. It has assimilated the syntax of everyday discourse, the very relationship between subject and object, humanity and nature. Difference was recast from its traditional status as unity in diversity into a linear system of separate, increasingly antagonistic powers, a system validated by all the resources of religion, morality, and philosophy. I like this kind of operation or order that he's starting to elaborate. The first part of what we read, that he's speaking about how it wasn't until the emergence of capitalism as a social machine that it really kind of broke those earlier social codes of the peasant village or the tribe. And I think that is something that also kind of resonate with what I read in the Lusengray's Anti-Oedipus, where they explore a kind of anthropological development from earlier pre-capitalistic primitive social machines towards the despotic social machine, like the kind of feudal social machine, and eventually to the capitalist social machine. And they also state how two things that he kind of mentioned pretty succinct in these short paragraphs. One is that the state as a potential always at the horizon of all of these tribes. It's not something inherently different in modern people or certain cultures that didn't exist in other cultures. It's that these earlier societies, as we've explored here in this book as well, had all kinds of social codes in place that were not something that is inherent or given from above. It's something that is almost unconscious, that emerges directly from their relationship with Earth, specifically in order to avoid the state forming, or rather this like locus of power and hierarchy forming. And so as I said here, even after these kind of languages, costumes, religions seem to replace each other rapidly, and change society, change form into more feudal kind of social machine. It wasn't until capitalism that this kind of thing completely disappeared, that the peasant village completely disappeared. And yeah, that just kind of reciprocates with what I read in other places. Also some of David Graeber's work. I think that's something interesting. And then he speaks about how it all kind of emanates from patriarchy, when women started losing their both objective and subjective status in society, which followed by from that, men stake out claims for the superiority of his work over woman's work. Then craftsmen assert superiority over the food cultivator and the kind of the farmer. And then the thinker affirms his sovereignty over the worker, and so on and so forth. All of the kind of hierarchies started being created. Anybody have anything else before we continue?
Yeah, just I'm thinking about this, how that is still cyclical, like how even in professions now, as a profession transitions from being like predominantly male to predominantly female, how pay tends to decrease. That it's like a process that still feels very ongoing.
Yeah, it's the same kind of cyclical stuff. It all ties back to patriarchy, and then completely keeps kind of percolating through everything else, basically. Also, something that comes to mind is Al-Khibri's work. She has a particular, let me see if I can find it, this great Origins of Patriarchy, I think it's called. Yes. Called Reproductive Mothering and the Origins of Patriarchy. I'll link it in the chat. It's a very good essay. Right. Shall we continue?
I wanted to mention real quickly, I've been reading more about matriarchy in Neolithic history. And if anybody is interested, there's a really incredible archaeologist named Maria Gambutas. I'll put it in the chat. And she has several books documenting how matriarchy was there before these patriarchal gods.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Link us. Okay, let's see. What accounts for these vast changes in humanity's development, aside from the meteoric impact of the great historical invasions, and were the darker, often bloody aspects, the unavoidable penalties had to pay for social progress? I'll read it again because I didn't read it in the right tone. What accounts for these vast changes in humanity's development, aside from the meteoric impact of the great historical invasions? And were there darker, often bloody aspects, the unavoidable penalties we had to pay for social progress? Our answers to these questions touch on one of the major social problematics of our time: the role of scarcity, reason, labor, and techniques in wrenching humanity from its brutal animal world into the glittering light of civilization. Alright, like, I just can't stop seeing the parallels to Deleuze and Guattari's work. I don't know if they engage with his work or he engaged with them, but it's like super. They called the primitive social machine machine of cruelty because of how everything was, first of all, like, it was part of the brutal animal world about like predator and prey and all that kind of stuff. Everything was revolving around that, but also because all of these social codes were inscribed on people's bodies with tattoos and rites of passage and rituals and sacrificial offerings and all that kind of stuff. Our answer to these questions touch on one of the major social problematics of our time: the role of scarcity, reason, labor, and techniques in wrenching humanity from its brutal animal world into the glittering light of civilization. Or, in Marxist terminology, from the world dominated by necessity to one dominated by freedom. My use here of the world dominated is not to be taken lightly. Its implication for Marxist theory will be examined later in this work. For the present, let me note that Enlightenment and, more pointedly, Victorian ideologies, the ideologies that Marx shared in these broad contours with liberal economists, explained man's ascent from Neolithic barbarism to capitalism in strikingly similar ways. These explanations are worth re-examining, not so much to refute them, but to place them in a larger perspective than 19th century social theory could possibly attain. According to these views, history's onward march from the Stone Age to the modern occurred primarily for reasons related to technological development of advanced agricultural techniques, increasing material surpluses, and the rapid growth of human populations. Without the increases in material surplus and labor resources that Neolithic society first began to make possible, humanity could never have developed a complex economy and political structure. We owe the advent of civilization to the early arts of systematic food cultivation and increasingly sophisticated tools like the wheel, kiln, smelter, and loom. All these provided an increasing abundance of food, clothing, shelter, tools, and transportation. With this basic reserve of food and techniques, humanity acquired the leisure time to gain a greater insight into natural processes and settled into sedentary lifeways, from which emerged our towns and cities, a large-scale agriculture based on grains, the plow, and animal power, and finally, a rudimentary machine technology. But this development, presumably so rich in promise for humanity's self-fulfillment, has not been free of Janus-faced ambiguity, of its dark side and treacherous aspects. The stream of human progress has been a divided one. The development towards material security and social complexity has generated counterpuntal forces that yield material insecurity and social conflicts unique to civilization as such. On one side, without the agrarian economy that the early Neolithic introduced, society would have been mired indefinitely in a brute subsistence economy, living chronically on the edge of survival. Nature, so the social theorists of the past country held, is normally stingy, an ungiving and deceptive mother. She has favored humanity with her bounty only a few remote areas in the world. Rarely has she been the giving nurturer created in distant times by mythopoetic thought. The so-called savage of Victorian ethnography must always struggle or wrestle, to use Marx's terms, with her perpetual life, which is ordinarily miserable and mercifully brief, tolerable at times but never secure, and only marginally painful and idyllic. Humanity's emergence from the constrictive world of natural scarcity has thus been perceived as a largely technical problem, creating an increasing surplus, dividing labor, notably separating craft from agriculture, and sustaining intellectually productive urban elites. Thus, given the leisure time to think, administer society, these elites could create science, enlarge the entire sphere of human knowledge, and sophisticated human culture. Go to the footnotes. How much this entire ideological complex of rescuing savage from the trials of nature, of paganism, and of the ignorance of modern technology, not to speak on profligate values, accorded with the colonialist mentality of Europe and America, is difficult to emphasize. Economistic interpretations of human social development, whether liberal or Marxist, provided a superb ideological rationale for bringing savage into history by placing them under Euro-American sovereignty, not only to civilize them culturally, but to industrialize them technically. For Marx, this consideration was all important in his treatment of the colonial world. But it was no less important for such rugged imperialists as Kipling, H. Rider Haggard, and Leopold of Belgium, the guy who had like a genocide of like 20 million people or something. It's Leopold King. I imagine that he is elaborating this kind of Eurocentric vision of the kind of development from so-called savage to so-called civilization to then kind of refute it. I can't see that it's going to go any other direction. Coming back to the text. As Proudhon plaintively declares, echoing the prevailing spirit of the time. Yes, life is a struggle, but this struggle is not between men and men. It is between men and nature, and it is each one's duty to share it. Marx assumed the same view towards the burden of nature, but he placed considerable emphasis on human domination as an unavoidable feature of humanity's domination of the natural world. Until the development of modern industry, both Marx and Engels argued, the new surpluses produced by pre-capitalist techniques may vary quantitatively, but rarely are they sufficient to provide abundance and leisure for more than a fortunate minority. This is so egregiously wrong compared to what we know now. Given the relatively low level of pre-industrial techniques, enough surplus can be produced to sustain a privileged class of rulers, perhaps even a substantial one, under exceptionally favorable geographic and climatic conditions. But these surpluses are not sufficient to free society as a whole from the pressure of want, material security, and toil. If such limited surpluses were equitably divided among the multitudes who produce them, a social condition would emerge in which want is made general, as Marx observed, and with want in struggle for necessities, and all the old shit would necessarily be reproduced. An egalitarian division of the surplus would merely yield a society based on equality in poverty, an equality that would simply perpetuate the latent conditions for the restoration of class rule. Ultimately, the abolition of class presupposes the development of the productive forces, the advance of technology to a point where everyone be free from the burdens of want, material insecurity, and toil. As long as surpluses are merely marginal, social development occurs in a gray zone between a remote past in which productivity is too low to support classes and in a distant future in which it is sufficiently high to abolish class rule. Hence, emerges the other side of humanity's drama, the negative side of its development, which conveys the real meaning of social problem, as used by Marxian theorists. Technical progress exacts a penalty for the benefits it ultimately confers on humanity. To resolve the problem of natural scarcity, the development of techniques entails the reduction of humanity to a technical force. People become instruments of production, just like the tools and machines they create. They, in turn, are subject to the same form of coordination, rationalization, and control that society tries to impose on nature and inanimate technical instruments. Labor is both a medium where humanity forges its own self-formation and the object of social manipulation. It involves not only the projection of human powers into free expression and selfhood, but the repression by the performance principle of toil into obedience and self-renunciation. Self-repression and social repression form the indispensable counterpoints: personal emancipation and social emancipation. For the present, it is important to ask if the problematic I have so summarily presented is quite as autonomous as earlier social theories have claimed. It is an inescapable drama, a dialectic that is woven into the human condition as the very substance of history. Because our disembeddedness from nature, our ascent to civilization, and our human fulfillment involves a penalty. The domination of human by human is a precondition for the domination of nature by humanity. That may well turn the success of this historic project into a grim mockery by yielding the dehumanization of humanity and the immolation of society. Any thoughts? I think if I understand this, he's elaborating the kind of court's thoughts on the development of societies and why hierarchy started appearing in the social machines, in the social fields. And he's about how there is this kind of agreement, or not an agreement, but something that seemed to be important to both Marxist and Engel and other social political theorists, as well as all kinds of colonialists and feudalism and whatever else. And that is the kind of agreement on the fact that without, in other words, the development of technology is here to kind of save humans from their fate. This kind of view of life as a brute, unforgiving, kind of difficult, in nature, and elevate them into, so-called civilization using these techniques. But it seems that society is stuck, according to like Marx and other theories he mentions here, in this kind of between this brute, difficult, challenging life of earlier times of savage social machines, and between this so-called utopian future of having enough technology to abolish class, and we are stuck in these like muddy waters right in between, where all of these technology created all of these forms of domination and hierarchy. And this is where we're at. And then he's finishing by asking, is this really the way it is? Does our human fulfillment really have to involve this kind of penalty of arising domination by humans by humans, and the domination of nature? Yeah. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree that I think my understanding technology has provided us like a temporary, in the timescale of human lives, it seems a very long time, but a temporary alleviation or ability to delude ourselves into believing that we're not constrained by the natural laws of nature. And yet in doing so, we've created this mythical separation from nature in our own minds and our, suffering from it. Like he says, the dehumanization of humanity and the immolation of society. Like we all know that we are lacking spiritually, we are lacking in community, we are lacking in so many ways, and we don't understand why we're so depressed and unhappy. And it's because we're not meant to live this way, in my opinion.
Yeah, it reminds me of there is a great, very long but great article by Daniel Schmechtenberger, and they have this
Yes. He's
institute. I forgot how is his institute called?
I can't remember right now.
I can link it in a moment when I have a moment to search. But basically, talking about this idea of progress, rather putting it suggesting to put it in a context of between mature and immature progress, where we have this kind of ambiguous premise in which technology doesn't have any kind of value of its own.
It provides conveniences.
Yeah, and doesn't and it is not coming inherently imbued with particular meanings.
Yes.
And I think and what he gave the example, for example, the plowing the fields with a bull, which was like a mark point in human civilization of, in the context of what we're speaking about here, it's very connected, domination of human over an animal. Because before that, I think they were not plowing at all. There was like no tilling kind of collaboration of food forests and all this kind of horticultural artistry. But then once they started using another animal, basically enslaving another animal to plow the thing, it kind of, this technology did not just produce kind of neutral results and affects. It created and started a whole process of domination. And I think this is also something that he's kind of pointing us here. Like each technology that we are creating is also bringing with it all of these kind of forms of domination, and the question is it really have to be this way? So Schmechtenberger was talking about thinking about progress in mature and immature ways. I think it's also very relevant to a lot of the conversations that we've been having about AI and LLMs and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, if anybody have any other reflections, I'm gonna search this article in the meantime.
There's a great podcast called The Great Simplification with Nate Hagans. And and he had Daniel Schmachtenberger on there, and I even took notes on my phone from from some of it. But he basically was talking about how we don't even know what it feels like to be fully human because we're so torn from the ecosystem and habitat that we evolved in, and the checks and balances within our community that we evolved with. And we have no idea like what we're missing. And I feel like as an ecologist, I know I get little glimpses of what it feels like to feel like you're moving in the flow of things, and you're able to communicate and understand what the natural world is saying and what the landscape is saying. And I know yet that all of those experiences I have are just this tiny little sliver of what it must have, the full, experience of being like fully human and not knowing what work was because we didn't have work, not knowing what scarcity was because it was built into our society to understand and to deal with that. Like not knowing what what it was like to fear death, because I think that that's a whole another thing that is tied up in all of this like feeling, this denial of death, denial of the temporalness of our existence. I don't know. Now I'm rambling, so I'll stop talking.
Yeah, 100%. I'm pretty sure that you will start elaborating, you will continue elaborating more about this kind of connection between techniques, technology, and the development of hierarchy. It's also interesting that he started with patriarchy first to kind of establish this stance. It's all of these technologies, this immature, this ambiguous notion of immature progress, started with patriarchy. Does anybody else wants to add something, or should we continue?
I guess I'm just thinking about like technology is not inherently bad, right? When we think about like we're like humans have always engineered and solved problems, but I guess like deciding what problems you're solving and how you're solving them, the morality of how you're solving the problems that you're faced with. Yeah, I'm just thinking about when like what makes the development of technology harmful, and it to me like it just feels like if the aim is ultimately profit and extraction versus solving a genuine problem in a way that feels like sustainable and morally sound and equitable, that is kind of where the issue lies. It's not like there's a binary of like there was no technology before patriarchy. Like that's not true, right? People engineered their environment long before patriarchy. It's just I'm thinking about like what is the shift.
Yeah, and animals use technology too. They use tools, and ants farm lots of insects.
Beavers.
Yeah, they use all sorts of technology. I think I've thought about this a lot. I think the difference is your worldview and belief behind using those technology, guiding the use of those technology, and whether your worldview and belief tells you that you are not a part of, or not constrained by natural laws. Like, for one, no other species will kill out all of its competition, right? And no other species takes and hoards mass quantities of their food, and they usually take what they need at the time,
And if
right?
they do, they will get extinct like us. Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. It's not that this potential doesn't exist, but it's a very bad survival strategy, right? Schmechtenberger in this article, which I highly recommend going through because it puts in context a lot of kind of technologies that we currently have and their impact. He's talking about this moving from the notion of immature progress to mature progress, which takes into account wide boundary consequences. And I think that's a very good framework to think about in terms of like, okay, how do we move from here? How do we think about technology in a way that is in alignment with the interconnectivity and the biosphere that we come from? And I think it's a pretty good way to think about things, not just in like technologies on the collective level that we are all using, but also everything that we do in our day-to-day life. Like, what are the wide boundary consequences of the circles of life that surrounds me, of the way I live my life, the way that I move through the world, the way that I relate and love and be loved and make love, the way that I consume and use, and of course that radiates to the way that we think about technology as a whole. Like, I think that LLM models would have all kinds of beneficial, helpful ways of using them. The thing is that we are so used to operating from this kind of the frames of immature progress, complete disregard to how it's called in economists externalities, as if it's like there are externalities to this technology rather than very real life consequences of poisoning, destroying, killing, murder. And so, yeah. Wide boundary. Okay. Continue a little bit more. In trying to answer these questions, we are again burdened by all the paradoxes created by hindsight. The drama that Victorian thought presents would seem irrefutable if we were to look backwards from the history layered by stages in which the last stage imparts functions on the first, such that every stage is a logical social descendant of previous ones. This reminds me of the book The Event by Zizek, this whole idea of the event. There is a certain wisdom in the view that the present enlarges the meaning of the past, which does not yet know itself fully in the light of its destiny. But the notion of destiny must never be simplified to mean predestiny. Yeah. Well, no. Yeah. But the notion of destiny must not be simplified to mean predestiny, like a predetermined kind of thing. History might well have followed different paths of development that could have yielded destinies quite different from those confronting us. And if so, it is important to ask what factors favored one constellation of possibilities over others. For the factors that have shaped our own history are deeply embedded in our sensibilities as the bad habits of the past. It's that we will have to cope with if we are to avoid the dark side of the future that lies before us. Let us consider the factor that has played an important ideological role in shaping contemporary society: the stinginess of nature. It is a given that nature is so-called stingy, and that labor is humanity's principal means of redemption from animality. In what ways are scarcity, abundance, and post-scarcity distinguishable from each other? Following the thrust of Victorian ideology, do class societies emerge because enough techniques, labor, and manpower exist so that society can plunder nature effectively and render exploitation possible or even inevitable? Or do economic strata usurp the fruits of techniques and labor later to consolidate themselves into clearly definable ruling class? In asking these questions, I am deliberately reversing the way in which Victorian social theorists have typically oriented such inquiries. And I am asking not if the notion of dominating nature gave rise to the domination of human by human, but rather if the domination of human by human gave rise to the notion of dominating nature. In short, did culture rather than techniques, consciousness rather than labor, or hierarchies rather than classes either open or foreclose social possibilities that might have profoundly altered the present human condition with its diminishing prospects for human survival? Our contemporary commitment to the logic of history in its typically economistic form has made it difficult to provide a serious and meaningful account of the explosive clashes between tradition and innovation that must have occurred throughout history. Instead of looking at the past from the standpoint of its origins, we have made both past and future captive to the same belief in economic and technical inexorability that we have imposed on the present. Hence, we have been serving up the present as the history of the past. Hence, we have been serving up the present as the history of the past, a typically economistically that slights the need for far-fetching changes in lifestyle, wants, sexual status, definitions of freedom, and communal relations. Accordingly, the stance we take with respect to human social development has a relevance that goes beyond our consciousness of the past. Recast in a more open and intellectually unconstrained manner, it may well provide us with a vision that significantly altered our image of a liberated future. I'm really loving it because it touches on so much of the kind of philosophers that I'm currently engaging with their work. Particularly, what came to mind about Zizek's The Event, this kind of way in which we perceive things as they are happening right now, but we don't really see all of the points in which got us there without the kind of hindsight that we have right now. It's something that is a bit of a mindfuck. It's hard for us to imagine. For example, take the economic collapse of 2008. You know, when you watch all these books, when you read the book or watch these movies, like the great, how is it called? The Great. There's like a known Hollywood movie about it. I forgot the name right now, but what is this noise? What's happening? Does anybody hear it, or is it just me? Or is this like content blipping? I don't know why.
I think it's just you. I don't hear anything.
Okay.
Yeah, most of our mics are muted, Yuval.
Okay, never mind. I'll just ignore. The Big Short is the name of the movie, and you look at this thing, and it's like everybody once the event happens, everybody knew that it's obviously that would have happened, but you don't see all of these many intersection points in which nobody knew that it's going to happen. And I think he's elaborating something similar about it's like challenging the very ways in which we look at the past, almost incapable of separating it from the hindsight that we have right now, the logics that are traversing our current ways of thinking, and makes us kind of avoid or make it very hard for us to think about all of these. How did he say? He said really beautifully. instead of looking at the past from the standpoint of its origins, days in which these societies have perceived themselves, their relation with nature, what is love, what is intimacy, what is all this kind of stuff, we have made both and future captive to the same belief in economic and technical inexorability that we have imposed on the present. This is why when you see a lot of Eurocentric historians, when they recount historical events, they always think about it in terms of the current ways of thinking, and they always measure those things in the way that we are currently seeing things. This is why for so many decades, any kind of archaeological figurine of a woman was immediately like a goddess this, a goddess that. It's all translated through our current stances and what we know now in hindsight. And it's an interesting thing to kind of keep in mind, I think. It's not the first time that he's mentioning it in the book. Like, we have been serving up the present as the history of the past. A typically economistic history that slights the need for far-fetching changes in lifestyle, sexual status, definitions of freedom, and communal relations. All of these completely different ways of seeing the world and engaging with the world that were part of the actual events of the past. I think it's a pretty interesting, yeah. What do you guys think?
Yeah, yes, exactly. It's talking about how our current, societal, cultural indoctrination is interpreting what it wants to interpret from history and refusing to acknowledge, like you mentioned, all of the figurines, that archaeologist that I shared, she talks about that as well, and how religions that are based on a woman or a goddess are called cults and not religions. And, we're just interpreting and pulling what we want to see in order to shape the story we want most beneficial to the.
Yeah.
I wanted to add on to what Lily said because kind of reminds me of our modern day times where we tend to, how do I explain this in words? Worship or kind of celebrify a celebrity in our modern day society. And a lot of people tend to expect that celebrities are also people of authority. So I wonder if that's in relation to how we interpret and worship people in modern day times, since we don't really have much of a religious connection in modern day times in comparison to previous generations. I wonder if that makes sense.
Can you elaborate?
Um, you know how Lily said that in religions, when you interpret like a goddess or any type of individual in reference to that, oh, that you're in a cult, I feel like there could be a comparison to me to our modern day time when we tend to worship and celebritize a lot of celebrities to the point where it kind of seems close to like dangerously worshiping them in comparison to a cult. And I'm curious if there can be a comparison made to that, because there is a tendency in the United States. I can't speak for other countries.
Did I miss something when did you start talking about cults?
Sorry, maybe I'm misunderstanding the context that Lily is saying.
Sorry, I was just saying the interpretation of history. Maria Gimbuta is that archaeologist. She talks about how whenever they find these female figurines, rather than acknowledging this as a fully formed religion and belief system, they use the term cults to describe, like cult of the Madonna or cult of
Yes,
what.
I wanted to add on to that. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Got it. I was like,
Sorry.
It's a way
no,
of
it's okay. I
demeaning.
admit that I missed a little bit of the context. All right.
Mhm.
Anybody else?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good grief, sorry. No, I think it's interesting what you're talking about. And it touches on so many things, but it's like what you're talking about cults and the Christian. I mean, the archaeologists were from white Christian background, right? And we're living in a white Christian, basically, society, which has been amplified through technology. So in a way, what we've lost is the sense of scale, because the technology is so superb, so efficient, that is amplifying absolutely everything. And the technology amplifies our mistakes and our preconceived biases, even if we're full of good intentions. And we can see that with how surveillance technology is not able to recognize non-white faces as well as white faces. And it's been quite well researched in MIT and other places like that. And there's this kind of constant editing of technology too, to serve the existing status quo. I mean, and a lot of this we don't even speak about. I think it was about in 2008 when the entire internet was migrated to new canvases, because they had actually built it inadvertently with freedom embedded into the system that they could not track, they could not censor. So around about that time, huge companies like Cisco, Nokia, all of them migrated the US-based internet to another technological platform. So it's like I think a lot of the issue with the technology is scale, because if a beaver makes a mistake, it's not going to destroy the entire world, you know.
Interesting point.
And it will be very important for on thinking in imagining different futures. How are we using technologies in different ways, better ways, in ways that actually free creative energies rather than, without the wide boundary consequences of destroying everything on the way. We will have to go back only to the past from the point of view of the present. We'll have to completely reimagine and really kind of genuinely explore how in each kind of intersection and event and technology and kind of point in the future and shift in social formation and organization, what were the worldviews that shift? What were the kind of stances, the kind of relational attitudes that shifted? Not just look at the event with the hindsight that we have right now and be like, now we can see that it's bad. Okay, but what changed? Like, why? Yeah, I think is what he's trying to point at here. Like,
I think. Sorry, you.
no, just to kind of to finish the point. Like I mentioned before, like the collapse of 2008 as an example. Like we can look at it and be like, oh, obviously that happens. Like they continue selling these, subprime kind of, crazy kind of bonds and all kinds of mortgages. They continue selling them. Of course, it crashed. But this is kind of like a superficial standpoint using the current hindsight that we have looking back. Obviously, that would have happened. But what are the kind of, like, if we go back in time, if we go beyond the kind of linear conception of time and we look at the event itself as like a metaphysical thing that actualizes, like at power, hierarchy, the state, as a even death and all of these kind of things, that always exist in the field, but then actualize in particular bodies in particular moments. And we ask ourselves, what made it actualize? What are the kind of premises and worldviews and attitudes and movements and kind of machinic essence that made that kind of thing possible? And then we go a little bit deeper and we look at all kinds of molecular, psychological, socio-political, economical kind of movements that make something like that possible. Yeah, what were you saying, Auntie?
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I'm still figuring out how to use this. I think there's, when I hear the words you're speaking, I see the dichotomy of the meaning between the US-based meaning and the European dream of the European notion of how to construct a society, a state, if you like. So we're a little bit behind you. In fact, that the American model has not yet impacted us. They're trying their damn best to have it come here through immense propaganda, far-right groups networking, trying to. They've already overtaken the political left with those who are compliant to neoliberalism, Zionism, hyper-capitalism. But what the two things which are really the problem is how the concept of society is constructed. So
Yeah.
the idea of freedom in the States is absolutely not the same idea of freedom here. And it's even in the UK is somewhere in between. So in the States, your idea of freedom is to have a society. How is it constructed, you know? You're constructed around the freedom to do what you want, essentially. The freedom to protect yourself with guns, the freedom to protect your family, this kind of concept, right? Because you're from historically a huge country which was inhabited by, was colonized by white Europeans, right? We are still very much working around a society that is built around the idea of communal welfare. And that means we have tax. So the entire structure of our society is built on having a tax number, which is abhorrent, totally abhorrent to my American left friends and even leftist friends in the UK. You know, they will kill each other rather than have an identity card. But that's exactly how everything is working here. But of course, that relies on a benevolent state, which adheres to certain values and also adheres to limitations. And part of those limitations is scale. So some of the discussion here is to force big monopolies to break up, like Amazon, eBay, all these companies, Facebook, that by law they should only have a limited amount of growth. And the other discussion is to limit salaries. So the limits are, not really easy to explain to my American friends.
Yeah, the very notion of what freedom is to be challenged, and for that we have to kind of, it's like there is a whole philosophical discourse of how things come to make sense that is sprung into existence. Like, how do we come to think about freedom in these particular ways? You know,
I think
yeah.
in relation to what you said, Yuval, I think one of the most important things is for people to realize that in order to make community, you can't have the freedom to dominate, which I think is something that's very prevalent in the United States. When people speak of freedom in the United States, they seem to imply the freedom to dominate over certain aspects of life, your individual life, other communities, or anything else. But I think if people have the concept that they have the freedom to dominate, then they can't really create a significant community like this.
That's so exactly on the point. That's exactly why I'm so furious with what is happening now, because they've completely destroyed the dream of this secular state which protects everybody's rights. Yeah.
Comments. I think we are gonna close here today because the next paragraph is pretty dense. I don't think we can get into it, and I have to attend to other things. Is that okay with everybody? Is there something else that wants to be communicated before we go
Not at
separate
all.
ways for now?
Not at all. Thank you for taking the time to do this. It's always greatly appreciated.
Yeah, great conversation, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good night.
And thank you for your participation, everybody who is listening to it after the fact. If you are not already, join us on Discord. If you want to join us live on this and be part of the conversation. And yeah, any support on Patreon will be much appreciated and will help me continue doing this sustainably. Thank you for listening. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Sending you much love.